All right, Alexander, we have.
Mohammed Marandi. northern Syria.
ونرفض أي
on national television.
The whole notion of logic.
These are the journalisms by way of critical aggregation, illuminated from the analytical research of a historiographer, neither from the Oriental nor the Occidental. Your engagement through a like, a share, and subscribe will accelerate us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before. On my mark, engage.
Engage impulse engines. Engage. Engage.
Engage.
Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage.
Engage.
Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Captain.
Engage emergency override.
Engage. Engage. Engage.
Engage forward shields, 35%.
Engage.
Engage the cloaking device.
Engage.
Of them. Engage them in conversation.
Engage. Engage.
Iran and Saudi Arabia resume ties. Watch this space. And this from IraqiNews.com. Iraq welcomes Saudi Arabia, Iran agreement. And from Baghdad, the agreement struck between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Republic of Iran, which marks the start of a new chapter in diplomatic ties between the two nations, was hailed by Iraq's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Conservatives between Saudi Arabia and Iran were often held in Baghdad thanks to the efforts put forth by the Iraqi government over the previous few years. And the strong foundation that they created. Conversations between Saudi Arabia and Iran were often held in Baghdad thanks to the efforts put forth by the Iraqi government, and the People's Republic of China and the Sultanate of Oman held subsequent negotiations that resulted in the agreement in order to create a framework that satisfies the objectives of all parties and ushers in a new, hopeful future. This will be reflected in the integration of relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and it will offer a significant boost in the collaboration for nations in the Middle East region. Iran and Saudi Arabia agreed to resume relations after China mediation. This is from Axios. Iran and Saudi Arabia have agreed to resume diplomatic relations after secret talks in Beijing mediated by the Chinese government, the two countries announced on Friday. Why it matters. It's a major breakthrough for the two Middle East rivals who haven't had diplomatic relations since 2016, when Saudi Arabia cut ties with Iran after Iranian protesters stormed its embassy in Tehran. It's also a diplomatic achievement for the Chinese government and sends a signal from Saudi Arabia to the Biden administration about the role China is playing in the Middle East. Catch up quick. Tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran have been high for years, including over the war in Yemen, where the two countries backed opposite sides. Those tensions reached a new level in late 2019 after an attack on Saudi Arabia's oil facilities, which the U.S. and other Western countries attributed to Iran. Yemen's Iran-backed Houthi so-called rebels, actually democratically elected government and majority in Sana'a, the capital, claimed the attack. Ali Shamkhani, the secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, told Iran's Noor News on Friday that Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi's recent visit to China and his meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping paved the way for Chinese mediation between the countries. Shamkhani said that he held secret talks in Beijing earlier this week with his Saudi counterpart Mossad bin Mohammed Al Aibane. The Iranian and Saudi foreign ministers will meet within the next 2 months and will announce the exchange of ambassadors and the reopening of embassies, according to a trilateral statement published by the official Saudi press agency. Saudi Arabia and Iran will resume their security cooperation agreement and their economic cooperation agreement, the statement said. What they're saying, removing misunderstandings and looking towards the future in Tehran-Riyadh relations will definitely lead to the development of regional stability and security, Shamkhani told Iranian Noor News. Shamkhani said the agreement will definitely be a serious obstacle to the presence and interference of extra-regional countries and the Zionist regime in the region. The Saudi National Security Advisor said at the signing ceremony that King Salman and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman welcomed the Chinese initiative, per the Saudi official's new agency said. He added that Saudi Arabia wants to open a new page in relations with Iran that will be based on international principles. China's top diplomat Wang Yi, who was involved in the mediation efforts, called the agreement a victory for peace. White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby said in a briefing with reporters that the Saudis informed the U.S. about their talks with Iranians. He added the U.S. wasn't involved in the agreement. An NSC spokesperson said in a statement earlier that the U.S. has long encouraged direct dialogue and diplomacy to help reduce tensions and reduce risks of conflict. Of course, it remains to be seen whether the Iranians will honor their side of the deal. From the cradle, the Arab world hails Iran-Saudi reconciliation as Israeli leaders trade blame. While resistance leaders across West Asia celebrated the news, the Israeli government blamed the weakness of former officials and the current U.S. government. Nations from across the Arab world are hailing the restoration of diplomatic ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia after 7 years of tension. Following several rounds of talks hosted by Iraq, Oman, and China on 10 March, officials from the two West Asian powerhouses agreed to reopen their embassies and missions within the next 2 months. The countries of the region have one destiny and common denominator that makes it necessary for us to join together to build a model of prosperity and stability for all peoples to enjoy, Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Faisal bin Farhan tweeted, following the bombshell announcement from Beijing. The return of normal relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia provides great capacities to the two countries, the region, and the Islamic world. Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian tweeted on Friday, highlighting the President Ibrahim Raisi's Look East policy is strongly moving in the right direction. The Syrian Foreign Ministry welcomed the agreement, calling it an important step that will lead to strengthening security and stability in the region and to cooperation that will reflect positively on the common interests of the people of the two countries in particular and the peoples of the region in general. Anwar Gargash, the diplomatic advisor to UAE leader Mohammed bin Zayed, took to Twitter to hail the new page in Iran-Saudi relations, saying, Abu Dhabi believes in the importance of positive communication and dialogue among the countries of the regions towards consolidating the concepts of good neighborliness. Similar reactions poured in from Iraq, Oman, Qatar, Bahrain, Turkey, and Egypt as officials from these nations all expressed hopes that this step would contribute to easing tension in the region. This is a win for everyone and will benefit regional and global security, said Oman Foreign Minister Badr Al-Bu Saidi. We hope in the long term there's also potential for increasing economic benefits for all, he added. Leaders from the resistance axis also welcomed the move during a televised speech on Friday. Hezbollah's Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah said this was an important development, and if it proceeds in its natural course, it can open new horizons for the region and Lebanon. The chief negotiator from Yemen's Ansarullah resistance movement, Mohammed Abdul Salam, said diplomatic ties between countries in West Asia are needed. The region needs the resumption of normal ties between its countries for the Islamic nation to reclaim its lost security due to foreign interference. He said, stressing that foreign actors have taken advantage of differences in the region and used them to fuel conflict. Palestinian resistance group Hamas also issued a statement following Friday's announcement, calling the restoration of ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia an important step on the path to unifying the region's ranks, enhancing security, and achieving stability in the region. The Palestinian Authority issued a similar statement highlighting the positive role of China in contributing toward reaching the agreement. Israel was the only nation in West Asia where the announcement caused alarm. A senior official in Benjamin Netanyahu's far-right government blamed the combined weakness of the previous Israeli government and U.S. President Joe Biden for the deal between Tehran and Riyadh. There was a feeling of American and Israeli weakness, so Saudi Arabia turned to other channels, the unnamed senior Israeli official told reporters traveling with Netanyahu in Italy. The same official also claimed that Israel's bid to normalize ties with Saudi Arabia will not be hurt by the restoration of ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia. What happens on the diplomatic level is now what happens under the surface, he said, according to Israeli public broadcaster Khan and Reshet 13 News. Meanwhile, former Israeli Premier Yair Lapid, who's been participating in mass anti-government protests over recent weeks, placed the blame for the deal at Netanyahu's feet. The agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran reflects the complete and dangerous failure of the Israeli government's foreign policy, Lapid said. This far-right government's focus not on Iran, not on the terror attacks, not on the economy, not the cost of living. All they care about is destroying democracy and tearing the people apart. Oh, and holiday weekends in Rome, too, he added. Similarly, Lapid's predecessor, Naftali Bennett, called the news a serious and dangerous development for Israel and a political victory for Iran. This delivers a fatal blow to efforts to build a regional coalition against Iran, Bennett said. Iran and Saudi Arabia resume relations after years of conflict. This is also from the Cradle. The breakthrough in mutual relations between the leading Islamic nation comes after decades of rivalry and conflict. Iran and Saudi Arabia announced the resumption of relations after a series of secret talks held in Beijing between the two rival Islamic nations, which concluded on 10 March, Al Arabiya Al Jadid has reported. According to a tripartite statement issued by China, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, the Secretary of Iran's National Security Council, Ali Shamkhani, arrived in Beijing 6 March for intensive talks for a final solution to the issues between Tehran and Riyadh, with his Saudi counterpart, National Security Advisor Musaid bin Mohammed al-Aibain, and the head of China's Office of the Central Committee for Foreign Affairs, Wang Yi. The statement indicated that the Iranian-Saudi talks in China came at the initiative of Chinese President Xi Jinping and have been underway for several years, with Iraq and Oman hosting preliminary talks between the two parties in 2021 and 2022. The two countries affirmed respect for sovereignty, non-interference in each other's international affairs, and to work to implement the previous security cooperation agreement concluded in 2001, as well as the General Agreement on Economic, Commercial, and Cultural Cooperation concluded in 1998. Iran, Saudi Arabia, and China also declared their firm will to make every effort to promote regional and international peace and security, according to the released statement. National Security Council Secretary Shamkhani also stated that the Iranian president's visit to China last month paved the way for new and serious negotiations between Tehran and Riyadh, and that the resumption of relations would remove misunderstandings and expand regional stability and cooperation in the Gulf and the Islamic world. Diplomatic relations between Tehran and Riyadh were severed in 2016 after Riyadh executed prominent Saudi Shiite cleric Nimr Bakr al-Nimr, and Iranian demonstrators attacked the Saudi embassy in Tehran and its consulate in the eastern city of Mashhad in response. According to Iran's Tasnim news agency, Saudi Arabia's military campaign against Yemen starting in 2015, as well as the death of hundreds of Iranian Hajj pilgrims in a deadly crush in Saudi Arabia's Mina in September of the same year, also led to the deterioration of relations between Tehran and Riyadh. But the Iran-Saudi rivalry had helped fuel conflict and promote sectarianism in the region for decades, starting with Saudi support for al-Qaeda groups in Iraq following the illegal 2003 U.S. invasion, and followed by Saudi support for al-Qaeda groups in Syria as part of the U.S.-led war against the Syrian government in 2011. And from Al Jazeera, this is Iran and Saudi Arabia. What does this historic agreement mean?
And one security pact that was essential at that time when it was signed to regional security. Both countries are saying that they want this deal to have its own impact on regional security, and regional security will mean also trying to contain the escalation in Yemen, the war in Yemen, maybe situation in Lebanon where there is no president because of these contradictions and clashes of interests between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Also, this will have its own reflection on the situation in Iraq and probably Syria also.
In the hours that we've heard about this news, Ali, we're getting the general impression that regional capitals in the Middle East are surprised about this announcement, as most probably as many as me.
This path started in Baghdad in 2021 and continued throughout 2022. Former Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi was the first to mediate between the two countries. Even before Mustafa al-Kadhimi, the other prime ministers tried to do that between the two countries, but it was during the Kadhimi's time that officials from Iran and Saudi Arabia met for 5 rounds of talks in Baghdad, and also other sessions on security levels in Oman. But of course, for the Iraqis, this wasn't a surprise with respect to the result, but it was a surprise with respect to the timing. No one thought that this is the deal that everyone was talking about. Everyone was thinking that a deal is going to be between Iran and the United States on a prisoner swap, but not between Iran and Saudi Arabia on reviving or restoring diplomatic relations.
Ali Hashim there for us in Tehran. Thank you. Well, Iran and Saudi Arabia have long had an adversarial history. Let's take a quick look at some of the news that's coming out of the Middle East. What's the reaction where you are?
Well, certainly the United Nations is welcoming this. The Secretary General was briefed on it first thing this morning as soon as the news emerged here in New York, and a very positive reaction. He believes that this could be good news for the entire region. We heard Ali talk about the situation in countries like Lebanon and Iraq. Yemen, I think, is the one where the UN will be most interested in this. Can they actually bring the war in Yemen to a proper negotiated settlement? We have a very uneasy truce that's been in place. It's nearly now 8 years. In the next few days, it'll be 8 years since Saudi Arabia intervened in Yemen, and they've been bogged down there ever since. That, I'm sure, is one of the motivations from the Saudi side. Of course, there are important implications with regard to Israel. Israel is the one country I think is not going to like this. They had been hoping that the US would persuade Saudi Arabia to join the Abraham Accords, get better relations with Israel, and completely isolate Iran. That's what Prime Minister Netanyahu wants, and it's not what he's going to get. I think the overwhelming thing that I'm seeing from this is a very different approach now to Saudi foreign policy. Traditionally, before Mohammed bin Salman, who now steers the strategy for the Saudi kingdom, Saudi Arabia very much was in the US camp on everything. But this deal, it was brokered today in China, and at the same time, the Saudi foreign minister was in Russia talking about his good relations with Russia. It's worth pointing out the Saudi foreign minister also was recently in Ukraine, and they have offered themselves as a mediator in that conflict. But I think Saudi Arabia now believes that it can't just focus on the US. It needs to look at all of the players in a multipolar world.
A developing story, certainly, from the UN there. Thanks, James Bays, our political editor there. Thank you. Kimberly Halkett joins us now from the White House, our White House correspondent. Kimberly, as the news has been breaking, we've been trying to get reaction from Washington. They'll be dealing with an issue of Saudi being a long-term ally and Iran being a long-term adversary.
Yeah, and speaking of adversaries, the White House seems to be somewhat sensitive that its other adversary, China, is the one that seems to have brokered this deal in terms of now the resumption of ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And when asked about this, the spokesperson, John Kirby, somewhat sensitive when speaking with reporters, really pushing back on the assertion that perhaps there is some waning diplomatic power in the part of the United States, that usually it's the United States that is brokering these type of agreements or sort of understandings, and really pushing back on this, saying that the United States was welcoming this, seeing it through the lens of efforts to help end the war in Yemen and de-escalate the tensions in the Middle East, and still acknowledging, though, that it did not have a hand in any of this, and in fact, though, saying that de-escalation and diplomacy is still a key pillar of the Biden administration's policies that they brought to Saudi Arabia just last year, but at the same time admitting that they were not in any way involved in the discussions that ultimately brought about this understanding between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Kimberly Halkett there, our White House correspondent. Thank you for the update, Kimberly. Well, joining me now here in the studio is Abdulaziz Sagar. He's the chairman of the Gulf Research Centre. Welcome to Al Jazeera. Nice to have you here, sir. And does this mean that hostility
with regard to the diplomat and political and diplomatic facilities, so that is also important. It talks about respect of the sovereignty of the state, which is very important. If we take all of this in account, and it says it's a new page, so basically what we are saying, we are trying to stop all the escalation, go to de-escalation now, focus on the unilateral relation that bring peace and security to the region here, and that means no intervention on the domestic affairs issues from Iran into Saudi Arabia, which is very important. That it has been, and your report did talk about the various issues that has been between Saudi Arabia and Iran in the past. But I think that's a positive step. It can look. Of course, there are lots of details in the future that need to be looked out. In other words, how is the implementation? Saudi Arabia always concerned about the interventionist policy, the expansionist policy of Iran, the support of the militia group, the energy security, the maritime security. So there are key issues, and also including the escalation in countries like Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, many of the issues.
And we'll get into that in a moment as well. I mean, how delicate, in your opinion, involved?
No, I think the Chinese president, when he visits Saudi Arabia on the summit of the Arab Gulf and Saudi-Chinese summit, I think it was clear when he stated that he wanted to see peace and stability and security in the region, and he wanted to see more constructive role from Iran. Although Iran at that time did not like it, and they called the Chinese ambassador in Tehran, saying that they don't like what they have heard. But as soon as the Iranian president visited Beijing, it was very important that the message was delivered, being the largest partner of both sides. I mean, Saudi and the Gulf, it's almost $130 billion with China, so we're the largest trading partner with China. There is almost 36% of China import of energy comes out of the Gulf countries. But at the same time, Iran is the biggest buyer of the Iranian energy is China. So this is why there is a big and interesting relation both, and this is why China had the leverage on the also absence of Russia being very busy with the Ukrainian crisis. China had the best.
In terms of the diplomacy that's been involved, the questions that are now arising are knowing that China's
not responding at the time when we wanted to respond. In your report, you talked about Shigeg and Begeg, the oil facility, where we've lost half of our oil production for a month. You see there. So all of that have raised the question, is the U.S. still the most reliable partner that we can rely on when it comes to the regional security, or also we need to keep our option open? When President Biden attended the summit in Jeddah, he wanted to see a big condemnation against the Russian, and also reducing the relation with China, but also getting out of the OPEC Plus and increasing oil production. None of these have been implemented, and the region said, well, we're no longer the same old boys that you used to know. I think here there is a sort of an interest that we need to protect both interests. You have your interest as a U.S. and we have interest as a region here, and we need to evaluate that and deal from that angle instead of just being a listener to what an implementer of your wish list.
It will be interesting to see what does happen in the coming months. For the moment, Abdulaziz Al Sagar, thanks so much.
And this is the Duran on the issue?
That it had agreed a military deal with the Russians to import Sukhoi 35 fighter jets. And I have to say, that did a little surprise me because I did wonder what the Saudis would think about it. And yesterday also, there was a telephone conversation between Putin and President Raisi of Iran, and the Kremlin readout was incredibly uninformative about what the two men discussed. But clearly all of this is all part of this Chinese broker deal. And the Chinese have obviously been working incredibly hard to bring the Iranians and the Saudis together. And the fact that there's been this deal done means that the Russians are able to go ahead with the arms sales to Iran. Probably Iran will pay not with weapons, not with money, but with economic links and other, drone transfers and that kind of thing. So just to make that point. Now, this is huge. It transforms the geopolitical geometry of the Middle East. I mean, one of the constants in Middle East politics for the last, ever since the fall of the Shah, was the rivalry between the Saudis and the Iranians. Now, I mean, they didn't all, quite a lot of the time, they did have diplomatic relations, but they were always rivals, they were always tense, they were always opposed to each other. It now looks, from the Chinese announcement, that all of that is now behind us. The Saudis and the Iranians have generally made peace with each other. That means that the Iranian-Saudi rivalry is over. That isolates Israel to some extent. That isolates the United States to a great extent, because it's relied on Saudi Arabia, as to enable it to carry out its strike against Iran. It undermines the US sanctions regime against Iran, because of course it means that Iran can now more actively participate in OPEC, which was a founding member, by the way. So, trade links are going to presumably be unblocked. It means that Saudi Arabia, for its part, can integrate with the BRICS and with Shanghai Cooperation Organization, as Iran is also doing. It means that we're now making another massive step, as you absolutely rightly said, to the creation of the alternative reserve currency to the dollar, because the two of the biggest oil producers, Saudi Arabia and Iran, have come together, and they're aligning increasingly with the Chinese, and to a lesser extent, obviously, but still there, important there, the Russians as well. And of course, last but not least, I can't help but think that this is also going to have an effect on relations on politics in Turkey. Turks can now see the direction that events are taking in their region. They won't want to be left out. And as you absolutely rightly say, it brings us a huge step closer to the moment when the Syrian war ends.
Yeah, I was going to ask you a lot of what you touched upon. I was going to ask you, but let me just ask you again. Okay, Israel. What does this mean for Israel, especially at a time when the Netanyahu government has real problems, domestic problems inside of Israel? What does this mean for Israel? That's the first point. What does this mean for the American troops in Syria and the U.S. that's occupying northeastern Syria right now? They must be feeling very, very isolated.
Yes.
Surrounded, very isolated and surrounded. And my third question, are we going to see an end to the war in Yemen now?
Yeah. Right, all very good questions. Let's start with Israel. I mean, this is a major blow for Israel. I mean, a geopolitical blow, because Israel's biggest ally in the Middle East, even though they don't have diplomatic relations with each other, but Israel's key de facto ally has been Saudi Arabia. And of course, Israel's biggest enemy in the Middle East has been Iran. Now what it's seen is that its key ally has made peace with its greatest enemy. So in effect, Israel has lost its key ally. Inevitably, its position in the Middle East has just become very much weaker. Now, I don't think this is a threat to Israel's existence or anything of that kind. I think, this is we're long past the point where Israel was threatened in that kind of way. But it does mean that Israel's position as, in some ways, the dominant political power in the Middle East, internal power in the Middle East, has now been weakened. And it also means that from an Israeli point of view, a strike on Iran has now become immeasurably more difficult. I mean, I presume they could still do it, but they wouldn't be able to use Saudi airspace in the way that they once could, or at least if they did, they'd have to do it without the Saudis' permission, which is, as far as I can see, deeply problematic, to say the least. So this is a very big blow for the Israelis. It's a very, very big blow for Netanyahu, who's positioned himself over many years as the person politically who is best positioned to lead this fight against Iran. And Netanyahu has, with some justification, prided himself on his diplomatic skills, and he was absolutely key to building up this de facto alliance with the Saudis. And of course, it's fallen apart, and with the collapse of that alliance, there will be more people in Israel saying, well, what exactly is Netanyahu giving to us? What is he providing us with that we need him anymore at a time when, as you correctly say, he's politically challenged? Now, there is one thing, and I'm not saying that this is the case, but there is one thing that perhaps Israel might take from this, and that is that I personally find it difficult to believe that this agreement could have been reached with the Saudis if Iran had not given the Saudis some kind of commitment that Iran will not move forward to develop nuclear weapons. Okay, so I think that perhaps as part of this deal, Iran has taken the issue of nuclear weapons finally off the agenda. This is a guess, by the way, but I think that's likely. In which case, if the Israelis really are worried about nuclear weapons in Iran, well, at least that threat perhaps has gone. In fact, by the way, fighter jets to Iran, and you can be sure the Russians have been absolutely up to speed with all the discussions, is also, I would suggest, a further sign that the Iranians are given cast iron commitments that they're not going to see nuclear weapons. So, as I say, if the Israelis are really worried about a nuclear-armed Iran, unlikely it's going to happen. Now, that's one thing. Now, let's turn to Syria and those American troops. Now, the Americans have clearly got wind of this affair because no less a person than Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, rushed to Syria, spoke to the troops in Syria, the US troops in Syria. You're absolutely correct. I mean, they've already been looking precariously isolated. Now it seems to me that their position long-term is utterly untenable, because with Iran, Saudi Arabia coming together, with Saudi Arabia, it looks in the process of carrying out what you might call a diplomatic revolution, which is to say, realigning with the Eurasian states. It seems to me utterly reckless to keep those American troops there, where they're becoming a target potentially for the Turks, for the Syrians, for all sorts of other people, and where their supply lines must be becoming increasingly precarious, and the bases from which the US can support them are gradually isolated one by one. I mean, for the US, to be clear about this is a catastrophe. I mean, a reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran is almost the worst geopolitical nightmare, and it demonstrates the extent to which decades of neocon policies in the Middle East have resulted in the collapse of American influence there. So that's what I think. I think sooner or later, those troops will have to be withdrawn, because realistically, their position now has become untenable. And thirdly, we talked about the war in Yemen. Again, just as I cannot see the Saudis agreeing to this kind of peace deal with the Iranians unless the Iranians gave cast iron guarantees that they were not going to seek nuclear weapons, just so I can't see the Iranians committing to this peace deal without some commitment from the Saudis to seek a genuine peace agreement in Yemen. And I suspect that over the next few weeks and months, we're going to see direct negotiations between the Saudis and the Houthis. And of course, the Chinese have demonstrated their diplomatic skills, and they're the obvious people to broker a compromise.
Haven't we been saying on this channel, show after show, that the U.S. is so absorbed, the Biden White House is so absorbed in Ukraine that they are losing the geopolitical diplomatic war everywhere else? And I think that this is proof to that. This is huge proof to that. Yeah, I have to ask you. China is the new global leader.
Yes,
I mean,
it
is that a correct statement to make? They are the new global leader. All countries now are going to be.
And this is DW's take on the Iran-Saudi matter.
I think it's that historic because, of course, these are neighboring countries, powerful countries that are rivals in the Persian Gulf region. So it's quite normal. This is the normal that they should have diplomatic relations in order to de-escalate and manage their respective conflicts. However, China, as a negotiator, as a mediator, is new here because the Chinese don't have a long track record of peacemaking in the Middle East, and we shouldn't forget, of course, the Chinese are now taking the credit. The chief negotiator and mediator was the Republic of Iraq. Which is a country that has borders with Saudi Arabia and Iran, and that used to be a battlefield of Saudi-Iranian competition. And that is also worth mentioning that this has been a Middle Eastern deal in a way that the Chinese have taken the credit for. As we say, of course, success has many fathers.
Right. Well, let's come back to the motivations on both sides, because this will change, potentially, the balance of power in the Middle East. Can you tell us what the implications will be?
Well, I think the Saudi government in particular displays a new self-consciousness, or let's say self-confidence, I'd rather say, and an independence from U.S. influence. For a long time, the Saudis let the Europeans and the Americans handle their international relations in the way, because in 2016, when there was an assault on the Saudi embassy in Tehran as a reaction to the execution of a prominent Shia cleric in Saudi Arabia, the Saudis withdrew the ambassador and cut the diplomatic ties, whereas the Iranians were always saying, we have no problem, of course, we need to talk and we want to have diplomatic relations. Of course, the Saudi government considered this an affront, a provocation, and they cut ties. But of course, the Saudis were in a way not present at the table when many international affairs were negotiated, like, for example, the international nuclear deal between the Western countries, the UN Security Council powers, and Iran. So I think the Saudis, with this new self-confidence in the region, want to show that they are independent from America. And that they are making new friends, or if not friends, then at least that they are talking to their neighbors. But I don't want to say that this means that all the problems are off the table. There's many problems to address, and maybe diplomatic relations are a good start to address these problems.
I'd like to come to back to that shift from Saudi Arabia as a traditional U.S. ally. Should this be seen then as Saudi Arabia?
Saudi Arabia has a fundamental interest in keeping the oil price high. And that means that it needs to coordinate not only with OPEC, but also with Iran and with Russia. So Saudi Arabia is an authoritarian regime that is not interested in uprisings, in turmoil, let alone in a liberal modern democracy. Saudi Arabia is, of course, much more aligned system-wise and sympathetic with authoritarian regimes like, for example, China and Russia. But it also shows, and this is an economic aspect which is worth mentioning, the Saudis have displayed a certain openness to trade their oil exports to China in yuan and no longer trade them in US dollars, which would be not a deadly but a strong blow for U.S. Financial interest in world economics, but in particular in the region. And so the Saudis are in a way showing, okay, we can deal with the Chinese, we can deal with the Russians, we can also deal with the Iranians, so we are much less dependent on U.S. support, because it's no secret that Mohammed bin Salman in particular and Joe Biden are not good friends.
Well, thank you so much for bringing us up to speed there. That is Daniel Gerlach.
First and foremost, I think
And here's CGTN on the matter.
It is important, especially since the region has been facing great difficulties, and there's been a lot of suffering over the last few decades because of the different divisions. In particular, we had Saddam Hussein's war against Iran, which had Western support as well as Saudi support. We had the dirty war in Afghanistan, then 9/11, and then the U.S. occupation, and subsequently the occupation of Iraq. And then, of course, we also had the dirty war in Syria, where NATO countries and their regional allies supported ISIS and Al-Qaeda to overthrow the Syrian government. So, and then of course the war in Yemen, where the people there have suffered under Saudi and Emirati attacks supported by the West. So you have all these conflicts, and of course then there's the Israeli regime, its attacks on Lebanon and Syria and on the Palestinian people. So we have many different divisions, but there are some positive signs as well. Right now we see gradually regional countries moving towards rapprochement with Syria, and greater rapprochement between Turkey and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. And if Iran and Saudi Arabia can move forward with rapprochement, then there's a greater opportunity to start rebuilding the region, especially after all of the hardships that people have been enduring. And the more the U.S. and its allies retreat from the region, the less influence they have on the region, the greater the opportunity there is for countries to come together, because the main reason for these divisions and the divide and the conflicts, the wars, dirty wars and sanctions is, of course, the United States.
Mohammed, what was China's role and influence in brokering this deal now?
What happened was that during President Raisi's state visit to Beijing, the two presidents spoke about the region and how to decrease tensions in the region and to build confidence among countries in the region. And they decided to see if they could use Beijing as a suitable platform to create rapprochement or bring about rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. There were talks, a series of talks between officials from Iran and Saudi Arabia in Iraq and other places, but this was the highest level. The two sides had a very high-level delegation in Beijing. The head of the Iranian Supreme National Security Council was there, and the talks lasted for a number of days. And so these talks were more serious and more intense, and they ultimately bore fruit. So Beijing definitely had a significant role to play in this change.
After decades of tension, now this deal, what is the significance of the timing? Why now?
Well, the world is changing very fast. It's becoming more chaotic. It's becoming more dangerous. We have the war in Europe. We have tensions rising over Taiwan. And of course, West Asia has always been a very volatile region for the last few decades. And therefore, both countries see it as important to have better relations during these very difficult circumstances. The United States has also shown itself not to be a very reliable partner. We saw that in Afghanistan. We even see it now in Georgia, where a government that is close to the West is being attacked by the West because of a proposed law. So countries like Saudi Arabia look upon these acts of Western countries, of NATO countries, and they feel it to be necessary that they should find alternatives, and they should diversify their contacts and relations, and to decrease tension so that they are not vulnerable to the United States and to NATO. And of course, for the Iranians, it is the policy of the new president in Iran is to strengthen ties with neighboring countries and to create greater convergence among Asian and Eurasian states. So this is a part of the new President Raisi's policy.
Mohammed, we have to leave it there. Good to talk to you, and thanks for your
TRT covers the Iran-Saudi matter.
Some sort of relaxation between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the two arch rivals in the region. And I think this is in principle good news for the region, it remains to be seen to what extent this kind of relaxation is enduring. And also, we have to wait for the reaction from the other two great powers, which haven't said anything so far. I'm referring to Israel and, of course, Turkey. But I think the second signal is even more important because this relaxation of tensions, or diplomatic tension, has been achieved under the mediation of China. We have to remember that President Xi visited Riyadh in December, and that was followed by a visit of the leader of Iran in February to Beijing. So China has long-term plans of inserting itself in the security arrangements of the region, partly because 40% of its energy supplies, come from the region, and it wants a stable region, but also because it wants to display this kind of long-term geopolitical influence game against the United States in the same part. So this is an important development. The challenge for China will be how to insert itself as a mediator in the region without getting entangled, as previous powers have done, in the conflict in the region. This is a fine line. But so far, I think it looks like China is playing this kind of long game of becoming a mediator, and also someone who has tried to do some. Russia is being sidelined as well.
Right.
So
I do want to ask you more about the significance of China being the one to
Obama to pivot away from the Middle East to the Pacific. But there was something else that changed in 2009, and that was the Arab Spring and the signal that the position of the United States sent at that time that, this kind of monarchies, the countries in the region cannot rely on the United States without any conditions. China interjected itself in this situation by promising exactly that we are not going to interfere in the domestic affairs, and that message resonated with a number of countries. But at the same time, we have to recognize that these powers in the Gulf also, they find the competition between United States and China useful. Saudi Arabia, for instance, is now in a process of trying to normalize relations with Israel. So by playing both on the relationship with the United States, but also with China, it finds itself in a better position of not being completely dependent on both sides.
Professor, I'd also like to ask you, if I can just interrupt real quickly, what do you think that this could mean as far as impact on regional peace? Do you see this as a positive step?
What I said at the beginning, it remains to be seen to what extent this is an enduring status, for between Saudi Arabia and Iran. But that was something that was desired, including by Turkey, a relaxation of the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia, because stability in the region is important. The critical factor here is the nuclear program of Iran. Whether it will go ahead, because we know that the uranium enrichment has reached a threshold almost close to 90%. And if they move above that threshold, there's going to be a strong reaction from Israel, also from the United States.
Well, it's just nothing you talk about.
President Biden promised that there is a red line, no nuclear weapons in the case of Iran. So that, I think, it's a variable that will remains to be seen. But
I think that last argument of his is just null. When the amount of nuclear warheads that Israel holds is pales in comparison to Iran. We know that. And another take from TRT.
Well, since day one after winning the election, the Iranian president stressed that he means to improve foreign trade, especially with the neighboring states. So improving neighborly ties has been a major agenda for President Raisi's government. And this is not possible unless you de-escalate the tensions with Saudi Arabia. That's why in his first press conference, even before his inauguration, he said that he was ready to reopen embassies in Tehran and Riyadh on the same day. There have been 4 rounds of talks at the initiative of Baghdad, hosting the talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Mr. Shamkhani's deputy was present in the talks, and they were improving well. But when President Raisi went to Beijing, he asked China to take a more assertive stance in this regard in order to mediate the talks, help the talks move forward. And his Chinese counterpart took the stance and invited the Saudis. Now, if you look at the Iranian media coverage to this story, you could see a positive and wide coverage of the development. But if you go to the Saudi media outlets, you could not see the same. They seem somehow brief and somehow hesitant. This could be the result of Chinese pressure, probably, on Riyadh to take part in the talks and to agree to the terms of the deal. But still, I can see Iran and Saudi Arabia both the winners of the day, especially after the Saudi schemes against Iran under President Donald Trump failed. Trump said he won't take to war for the sake of Saudis against Iran. And then their joint ventures with the Israelis didn't move forward pretty well. And the last round of that was in autumn, in fall, and they failed in the riotings. So I believe the best and the only option available for Riyadh was rapprochement with Iran after the UAE and Kuwait both sent back ambassadors to Tehran several months ago.
This was obviously a major diplomatic breakthrough, and I'm wondering what it could lead to. Could this pave the way potentially for a breakthrough in ending regional conflicts?
This could help move, de-escalate the tensions in the region, in Syria, in Iraq, and in Yemen. And in Lebanon, the two sides could work out mechanisms, security, and joint economic mechanisms in order to help regions in the nation, especially considering that Iran and Saudi Arabia have been rivals for quite a long time. But of course, this requires honest moves towards this rapprochement. Sometimes some states take formal stands that goes one way, but in action they go the other way. And here I have my own doubts about the Saudis because of their rapprochement with Israel in the recent years. Now, this has been a major blow to the Israelis. Admittedly, Yair Lapid as well as Naftali Bennett, both premiers of Israel in the last 1 or 2 years, they have been complaining that this has been a major blow to the Israeli foreign policy and regional policy. They are losing a new ally. So this could, start Israeli animosities and troublemaking in the rapprochement between the two sides. If the Saudis, stop going both ways with Israel and Iran, and if they speed up joint ventures with Iran, I believe that the two sides could help each other a lot. The last but not the least, the U.S. neocons have also admitted that this has been a major loss for the American foreign policy in the region, as they are being absent in the region. The Chinese are taking more assertive role in the region, and this shows that the world is changing. So this is also a major win for the Chinese.
Okay, we're going to leave it there.
And here's a Somali take on it.
in uu 5 sano oo kale wadankiisa sii hayo markii dhaqaalihii uu cirka ku shareeray maciishadii wax soo saarkiisina ay bateen dunidana uu saameyn ku yeeshay.
Actually, watch this space. We'll be back with more news. And from the cradle, Yemen-Saudi truce may be renewed in coming days. Report. Saudi Arabia's foreign minister said this week from Moscow that the Yemen truce agreement is Riyadh's priority. Emirati newspaper Al Arab released a report on 9 March stating that an agreement to extend the UN-brokered humanitarian ceasefire agreement between the Ansarullah resistance and the Saudi-led coalition may be announced during the coming days. According to sources cited by Al Arab, the truce extension this time will be according to the specifications of a comprehensive peace agreement, not just a ceasefire agreement. The report states that this may happen during Ramadan, which begins on 22 March. Dialogue will continue despite all the difficulties as a result of the international and regional insistence that the negotiations not fail. The newspaper added about the Omani-mediated talks between Ansar Allah and Saudi Arabia. It goes on to say that the truce agreement will be extended for 1 year, focusing on economic and humanitarian aspects. Coinciding with the Emirati report was a press conference held in Moscow between Saudi Foreign Minister Faisal bin Farhan and Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov, during which the broad points of the ongoing negotiations with Ansar Allah, though Omani mediations were discussed. Farhan stated during the press conference on 9 March that Saudi Arabia's priorities are ceasefire and dialogue among the Yemenis themselves. 2 days earlier, on 7 March, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman met with President of the Saudi-backed administration in Yemen, Rashid al-Alimi of the Transitional Presidential Council. During the meeting, MBS reportedly briefed Alimi on the developments in efforts to renew the truce. In recent months, the Saudi Arabia and Yemen's Ansar Allah-affiliated National Salvation Government, the NSG, have been involved in negotiations mediated by Muscat and aimed at extending the truce agreement, which expired on 2 October 2022. As a result of these negotiations, Saudi Arabia has reportedly agreed to the Sanaa's terms, which include lifting the blockade on the port of Hodeidah and Sana'a International Airport and paying government employees salaries in NSG territory. Even though no progress has been made in this regard yet, analysts suggest that Saudi Arabia has become more serious regarding reaching a solution, given that the war has become highly costly for it. Just 1 day after the Emirati report was released on 10 March, Saudi Arabia and Iran announced the resumption of diplomatic relations after 7 years of severed ties. The resumption of ties came after a series of secret talks held in Beijing and mediated by China. Political analysts have suggested that a Saudi-Iranian rapprochement will ease the process of renewing the truce agreement in Yemen, given the close relationship between Tehran and the NSG. And Ansar Allah on restoration of Iran-KSA relations. Region is in need of regaining security away from U.S. Zionist interventions. This is from almanar.com. The spokesman of Yemen's Ansar Allah movement, Mohammed Abdul Salam, commented via Telegram on the announcement of the restoration of the relations between Iran and Saudi, an agreement aimed at resuming relations between the two countries. Saudi Arabia had led a regional coalition to launch a destructive war and impose a starving blockade on Yemen, killing dozens of thousands of innocent civilians and destroying the infrastructure in the impoverished country. Although the UN announced a ceasefire in 2022, the coalition continued besieging the Yemenis, suffering from dreadful living conditions. And from almasira.net.ye, Iran-Saudi reconvened spells a catastrophe for U.S. hegemony, analysts say. An American geostrategic analyst and writer has said that the restoration of diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia is a catastrophe for U.S. hegemony, which is founded on permanent instability between any potential allies and competitors. After several days of intensive negotiations hosted by China, Iran and Saudi Arabia reached an agreement on Friday to restore diplomatic relations and reopen embassies in each other's countries, 7 years after ties were severed over several issues. Daniel Patrick Welch said in an interview with Press TV on Friday, "It's huge. Without the Shia-Sunni split for the U.S. to exploit, where could the world be headed?" he asked poignantly. The U.S. and its imperial watchmen never sleep and are always on the lookout for things like this. Their fake veneer of diplomacy and values are, in fact, the very opposite of what they pretend. China's role is the hallmark of a new era without having to rely on two-faced U.S. diplomats who are usually largely managing their own interests. Nations, societies, and cultures at odds could gasp instead of spending trillions on destroying each other might actually work, dare we say it together, for the advancement of humankind, he stated. By contrast, the U.S. brimming with the hubris of an out-of-touch rich uncle treats this role with none of the same sincerity, like strolling into Kazakhstan and saying things like, "We are a leader in Asia," the analyst noted. Or another example would be to use brazen acts of terror and violence like blowing up gas pipelines between Russia and Germany to turn potential allies into adversaries at war. Backstabbing acts of evil which turn out to be the distress signal of a dying empire, Welch included. Iran and Saudi Arabia reached an agreement in the Chinese capital of Beijing to restore their diplomatic relations and reopen embassies and missions. The deal was struck on Friday following intensive negotiations between Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council Ali Shamkhani and his Saudi counterpart in Beijing. It was officially announced in a joint statement by Iran, Saudi Arabia, and China. The statement was linked by Shakani Musaid al-Aiban, Saudi Arabia's national security advisor, and Wang Yi, the director of the Office of the Central Foreign Affairs Commission of the Chinese Communist Party. Shamkhani's been involved in exhaustive talks with his Saudi counterpart in Beijing since Monday to find a final solution to the issues between Tehran and Riyadh. The negotiations followed a meeting between Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping in Beijing last month. And from the public radio, Yemen sides began UN broker talks on prisoner exchange. The UN says Yemen's warring sides have begun talks aimed at implementing a UN broker deal on a prisoner exchange. The discussions between Yemen's internationally recognized government and the Houthi democratically elected government are taking place in Switzerland. They're co-chaired by UN envoy for Yemen Hans Grunberg and the International Committee of the Red Cross. Grunberg urged both parties to engage in serious and forthcoming discussions to agree on releasing as many detainees as possible. According to a UN statement, Yemen's conflict erupted in 2014 when the Iran-backed Houthis seized the capital of Sana'a, prompting a Saudi-led coalition to intervene months later in a bid to restore this internationally recognized government to power. Yemen's warring sides began talks Saturday aimed at implementing a UN brokered deal on a prisoner exchange, the UN said. The discussions between Yemen's internationally recognized government and the Houthi government are taking place in Switzerland. And UN urges parties in Yemen to fulfill commitment to release prisoners. That is also from Al Arabiya News. We won't go with that one. That one specifically, it's less related to Saudi, although it is having to do with the Yemeni issues. So this is an Al Jazeera take on the Yemen situation.
Doha, thank you. Well, let's get the view on this from Yemen now with Hussein al-Bukhati. He's in Sana'a. He's a pro-Houthi journalist and joins us. Good to have you with us on the programme. Can I just get your reaction to... news coming out of China about this new deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia and how it might impact and will impact Yemen?
I don't think it will have any impact on Yemen. I mean, we remember that when the war started on Yemen on 26th of March 2015, Saudi still had ties with Iran. They only closed the embassy in January 2016. So the reopening of their embassy or closing it again in the nearby future, it will not actually affect Yemen's. But as Mohammed Abdel Salam, the spokesperson of Ansarullah, he has made a comment about this latest agreement between Saudi Arabia, and he said that the region actually is in need for normal relation to return between all Islamic and Arabic nations, especially in this region, to face together what he called the Zionist and the American intervention in Yemen, which he said that intervention actually invest in dispute between countries. That's why here in Sana'a, of course, they will welcome any agreement either between Saudi Arabia Arabia, between Iran, or between any other Arabic and Islamic nation. But I think what will affect Yemen is the total lift of Saudi blockade. I just want to remind you that we are coming close to enter the 9th year of the Saudi war and blockade on Yemen, which is on the 26th of March of this month. And I believe, as I hear from here, that the Saudi Arabia have these 2 weeks to show a goodwill and to reopen, total reopening of Sana'a airport, and as well a total reopening of Hodeidah port, and as well to pay the salaries of all Yemeni civilians from the oil revenue that is Saudi actually is collecting from selling Yemeni oil. And I think that Saudi will not take.
Let me just jump in there. Let me just, Mr. Bukhati, let me just jump in there. Mr. Bukhati, you need to let me, Mr. Bukhati, you need to let me jump in there. You need to let me ask Yemen that are
without any Saudi have here in Sana'a, they have, especially Ansar al-Houthi, they have always called for an internal meeting and agreement between Yemenis without any Saudi intervention. But as you mentioned, these all groups, they are actually just tools or toys of Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. They are even fighting each other. And what is actually important for Sana'a, as they say, is it will be their main goal is a total liberation from Yemen, and this liberation will be from any foreign troops in Yemen, and it will be from to fight those troops who are actually loyal to this intervention and occupation on Yemen. And that's why they are very creative, but they have always welcomed any talk with any of these groups, either in the south or even though the Muslim Brotherhood, but they should actually cut their ties with Saudi Arabia, or they should not be used for Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates as tools to destroy Yemen.
Indeed.
We'll be back with more news. China to U.S. Stop plundering Syrian resources. Pull troops out. This is from Press TV. China's called on the U.S. to stop plundering the natural resources in Syria and withdraw its military forces from the country. We call on the U.S. to sincerely respect the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of other countries and to immediately stop its illegal military presence and marauding in Syria. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning told a news briefing on Friday. China also urged the U.S. to lift the illegal sanctions slapped on Syria and to stop all the actions that exacerbate the humanitarian crisis in the country. The U.S. has illegally intervened in military activities related to the Syrian crisis, which has led to the death of a large number of innocent civilians and a serious humanitarian disaster, Mao said, adding that his government calls on the U.S. authorities to lift illegal unilateral sanctions against Syria and to stop actions that aggravate the humanitarian situation in the country. According to the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson, since 2014, the Syrian crisis in the country has resulted in at least 350,000 people losing their lives in the violence and 14 million being in dire need of humanitarian aid. In the meantime, the U.S. Congress on Thursday rejected a bill calling for the exit of U.S. occupation troops from Syria. The majority of the U.S. House lawmakers, 321 to 103, voted against the Syria War Powers Resolution, which required U.S. President Joe Biden to bring American troops home within 180 days. The rejected bill was introduced by a Florida Republican lawmaker, Matt Gaetz, followed a recent incident in which 4 American soldiers were wounded while conducting a raid in the Arab country. Gaetz slammed U.S. lawmakers for voting against the bill, insisting that the U.S. Congress had never authorized military action in Syria in the first place. There's no role for the United States of America in Syria. We are not a Middle Eastern power. We've tried to build a democracy out of the sand, blood, and Arab militias, Gaetz said. Time and again, the work we do does not reduce chaos. Oftentimes it causes chaos, the very chaos that then subsequently leads to terrorism. While today's vote may have failed, my fight to end forever wars and bring our troops home has only just begun, he added. Gaetz further noted that several prior Inspector General reports have concluded that a resurgence of Daesh in Syria is unlikely, instead claiming that the American presence had served as a recruiting tool for the terrorist group. U.S.-led occupation forces invaded Syria in 2014 under the pretext of the emergency of the Daesh Takfiri terrorist group, which had seized huge swaths of land in both Syria and neighboring Iraq and aimed to overrun Iran as well. U.S. created terrorist groups in the Middle East to further its imperial agenda. It took over 3 years for the national Iraqi and Syrian armies to liberate the areas from the grip of the world's most notorious terrorist group. Damascus and Baghdad declared the extermination of the terrorist outfit in late 2017 and have since been involved in clear-up operations against the extremist group's remnants. Despite the announced demise of Daesh, Iraq's border regions, shared with Syria, are still suffering from sporadic attacks by underground cells. And from the cradle, China urges Washington to end occupation and marauding of Syria. Beijing's reportedly called on the White House to end its illegal practices inside Syria. The nation was also among the first to send aid to Syria following last month's earthquake. China's repeated calls for the U.S. to end its illegal military occupation of Syria and stop looting the country's resources, stressing that its continued presence has worsened Syria's humanitarian crisis. We call on the U.S. to sincerely respect the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of the other countries and to immediately stop its illegal military presence and marauding in Syria, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning said during a news conference on 11 March. The U.S. has illegally intervened in military activities related to the Syrian crisis, which has led to the death of a large number of innocent civilians and a serious humanitarian disaster, Mao added before calling on U.S. officials to lift crushing economic sanctions on Syria. Beijing's call came just 2 days after U.S. lawmakers voted against a war powers resolution that called for withdrawing troops from Syria. Around 900 U.S. troops are currently deployed in the Levantine nation, controlling nearly a third of the country and a large portion of its oil fields. Their deployment is illegal under international law and was not approved by the government in Damascus. This is not the first time Beijing has bashed Washington's illegal presence in Syria. Back in January, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin said Syria's energy crisis and humanitarian disaster are a result of the U.S. and its proxy militias plundering its resources. U.S. stationing troops in Syria is illegal. U.S. smuggling oil and grain from Syria is illegal. U.S. missile attacks against Syria are also illegal, he said. A year ago, Chinese and Syrian officials signed a memorandum of understanding welcoming Damascus into the Belt and Road Initiative. Launched 9 years ago, the BRI is a mega infrastructure project that seeks to bring capital and infrastructure to global South countries while dramatically strengthening connectivity for commerce, finance, and culture. China was among the first nations to send aid to Syria following last month's devastating earthquake, when aid deliveries from the West were being held up due to U.S. sanctions. And from Mayor News, China calls on U.S. to pull troops from Syria. We call on the U.S. to sincerely respect the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of other countries, and to immediately stop its illegal military presence and marauding in Syria, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning told the news briefing on Friday, according to Press TV. China also urged the U.S. to lift the illegal sanctions slapped on Syria and to stop all actions that exacerbate the humanitarian crisis in the country. The U.S. has illegally intervened in military activities related to the Syrian crisis, which has led to the death of a large number of innocent civilians and a serious humanitarian disaster. Mao said, adding that his government calls on the U.S. authorities to lift illegal unilateral sanctions against Syria and to stop actions that aggravate the humanitarian situation in the country. According to the Chinese Foreign Minister spokesperson, since 2014, the Syrian crisis in the country has resulted in at least 350,000 people losing their lives in the violence and 14 million people being in dire need of humanitarian aid. U.S.-led occupation forces invaded Syria in 2014 under the pretext of the emergence of the Daesh Takfiri terrorist group, which had seized huge swaths of land in both Syria and neighboring Iraq and aimed to overrun Iran as well. And from ChinaMill.com.cn, China urges U.S. to end illegal occupation plundering in Syria, Foreign Minister spokesperson. Beijing, March 10th, Xinhua. China calls on the U.S. to immediately end the troops' illegal occupation and plundering in Syria, removing illegal unilateral sanctions, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning said on Friday. Mao made the remarks at a regular press briefing when answering a query concerning the U.S. House voting down a bill directing removal of troops from Syria this week. Mao said since the U.S. began its illegal interference in the Syrian crisis, its military operations in Syria have taken away a large number of innocent civilian lives and caused grave humanitarian disasters. The U.S. has been criticized multiple times by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Syrian Arab Republic of the UN for indiscriminate attacks that may amount to a war crime, said the spokesperson. Noting that the Syrian crisis will soon enter its 13th year, Mao said at least 350,000 people have lost their lives and 14 million people are in dire need of humanitarian assistance. We call on the U.S. to respect other countries' sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity, immediately end the troops' illegal occupation and plundering in Syria, remove illegal unilateral sanctions, and stop creating and aggravating humanitarian disasters, Mao said. And I'm going to open the channel here. Beam me up.
Beam me up, Mr. Spark. Beam me up. Lock on transporters. Beam us up. Beam us up. Quickly. Beam us up home. Beam us up.
Prepare to beam us up, Mr. Scott. Beam us up, Mr. Scott.
Prepare to beam us up. Mr. Scott, prepare to beam us up. Have Scotty beam us up. Beam us up. Beam us up. Scotty, beam us up fast. Stand by to beam us up. Scotty, beam me up.
Beam me up.
Beam us up now!
Stand by to beam us up.
No need to beam me up, sir. The situation is under control.